want to welcome in the studio with me now DW political correspondent Julia Saudelli and Jan Techo. He's a director and political analyst at the Eurasia Group. So great to have you both here. Let's pick this all apart. First of all, your takeaway from last night's results.
Well, the results were pretty much in line with predictions, so the polls were quite reliable this time around. That has not always been the case in the past. I think what was surprising is that it took so long to sort out whether those two small parties would make it in or not, because that was so important for the question as to whether you can form a coalition with 2 or 3 parties, really the decisive question of the night. Other than this, it will be probably a coalition of weaklings. The Conservative result was, the strongest, but wasn't strong. The Social Democrats lost massively. That was a slap in the face, and they will still be in the next coalition, very likely. So the mandate will be weak, and all of that in face of massive international and national challenges. That's going to be a rough ride.
Yeah. Historically, bad results for the Social Democrats. Who's to blame? Is it Olaf Scholz?
I mean, if we look at his popularity among voters, possibly he's one of the most unpopular chancellors in post-war German history, and there are likely going to now be consequences for Scholz. He's unlikely to actually continue to have a relevant role in the party, given these very catastrophic results we've seen coming from the SPD. Some of its leaders saying that it's time for a new generation to take charge with the party. And, it has been a steady decline for the party, and clearly something has to change, starting with the leadership, but also possibly how they approach what their voters want to see.
Mm-hmm. The incumbent, or the man who's coming in now into the post, Friedrich Merz, he has no governing experience whatsoever. This at a time of unprecedented global challenges. Is he the right man for the job at this point in time?
Well, we will find out very soon. Even the coalition talks that will commence maybe in 2 or 3 weeks' time will be a leadership challenge, to him. He will have to deal with a party, an SPD, that, luckily is in government again, from their perspective, after this massive defeat. And bringing this together and then, forging out of this a coalition agreement that is up to the challenges, the massive economic crisis, the geopolitical problems that Germany has, that will already, test him and perhaps bring him to the limits of what he can do, and how he then fares on the international stage is entirely untested. He's done a couple of smart things in the run-up to this election. He's reached out to many European leaders, so there is already a working relationship with some of them, so that's a good thing. But, once you have to sit down in that European Council building and hammer out a late-night kind of compromise, that's when real stamina is required, and we will have to see whether he can do this. He's untested.
Yeah, he's untested. He will have to strike a compromise first here in Germany. Do you see in the current political discourse a will and a pragmatism that would be needed to find a coalition, find common ground sooner rather than later? They want to have a coalition standing by no longer than Easter, I think it is.
I think during the campaign, we haven't really seen that readiness for compromise, especially coming from Friedrich Merz. He was quite aggressive in campaigning against the SPD and the Greens and the other members of mostly actually the Social Democrats and the Greens within the governing coalition. He had a sort of softer spot for the Free Democrats. But indeed, it was a lot of aggressive campaigning against them and basically saying, no, he does not want to compromise. We've seen that also in Parliament now in January, when he brought forward a migration motion that non-binding, but which ended up being approved thanks to the votes of the AfD. He came in with this motion saying, I don't want to compromise on this. I'm going to have my way regardless. People are now hoping to see some more readiness for compromise going into these coalition negotiations, because that's what parliamentary democracy is made up of compromise, and without it, it's going to be impossible to find an agreement to form a coalition.
The Social Democrats, they're in an interesting spot right now, aren't they? Because they took a terrible beating yesterday, but they are in a very powerful position now, so to say, because without them, there won't be a coalition. Any way to a majority goes through the SPD. How do you expect them to play that?
I mean, it cuts both ways. On the one hand, they're required, they can ask for a lot. On the other hand, if they overplay their cards, they have nowhere else to go except into opposition, and that's going to discipline them as well. I'm fairly confident that we will get a compromise. I mean, compromise in Germany is possible. The big question is, will it be a compromise, an ambitious one? One with an agenda that really matters and that is up to these massive challenges that I've mentioned before. I think we cannot have a situation where the Conservatives and the Social Democrats neutralize each other with their respective demands, and then they come out with the least common denominator agenda. I think what we need is something where that kind of ritualistic kabuki kind of falls by the wayside and something more ambitious comes out of it. That's the big question that I think will be answered in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and then we'll see, can they seize this historic moment, which is really out there, not just because of the elections, but because of everything else around it that we find on the agenda today.
Yeah. Yesterday, we heard all of the leading candidates, the leading figures of the parties speak at the same table together. The one who struck a more combative tone, I'd say, was the leader of the CDU's sister party, the CSU, and they will also be part of any kind of negotiation. What would be their power going into a three-way talk to get a two-party coalition standing?
I think the first main point is that I'm sure the CDU is quite happy to be able to form a coalition without the Greens being involved. We'd heard from the leadership of the CSU that for them it was a no-go to have the Greens in the same government at the federal level with them. So that seems like a possibility that might not have to happen, and that might make it easier for them to accept conditions that the Social Democrats might pose. The CSU is quite strict on migration. They're also the ones sort of pushing for the Conservatives to push forward a tougher, even tougher stance on migration. The Social Democrats in government now have already toughened those measures, but whether they are willing to go all the way together with the CDU and especially the CSU, we're going to have to see what kind of compromise they find there. Mm-hmm.
One party that will not have to find compromises because nobody wants to work with them is the far-right AfD. They've been striking a combative tone on Sunday, of course, also putting, again, the topic of migration front and center. The AfD co-leader Alice Weidel spoke to supporters on election night, praising her party's strong gains. She said a coalition without the AfD would be unstable and doomed to fail.
And as we've seen in the exit polls, what we've seen is that we are the only party who have doubled our position over the last election. Double. They wanted to cut our numbers in half, but the opposite is what has occurred. And one thing is for sure, we will always have an open hand to get involved in a coalition in the German government. The will of Germany is something we will implement. We are always prepared to fulfill the will of the people in a German government. It remains to be seen what will happen in the next few weeks. But, friends, if what we predicted occurs, that the CDU carries out election fraud on the AfD by copying our program and then entering into a coalition with the left wing, then there'll be new elections faster than you can imagine, and we will overtake the CDU, and that is our aim.
DW political correspondent Matthew Moore joins us now from Berlin. He takes a closer look at the far-right AfD party. Matthew, the AfD flying high, but no option for power because nobody wants to govern with them. Where does that leave the country and the AfD?
Very good question. I'll just before I answer that question, I'll tell you where I am. I'm outside the press conference that will take place in the next few minutes with the party leaders of the far-right Alternative for Germany, and there's a huge interest in this, and that's really because for the first time in Germany's post-war history, the second biggest force in the German parliament will be an anti-immigration, anti-European Union, a party that wants to take Germany out of the euro currency, a party that wants to re-establish relationships with Russia, that is critical of NATO, and for that it poses huge questions for the German political landscape and for Germany as a whole. And also, it's worth just remembering who this party is. This is a party that in several of its state associations are considered right-wing extremists by security services. Some of its senior figures are considered right-wing extremists. One of them can be legally called a fascist. A court has ruled. And this is a party that is under suspicion as a whole by the security services in Germany for being a suspected case of right-wing extremism. And this is a party that members of the Bundestag, until very recently, wanted to initiate proceedings to look at banning the party. So now that party is the second biggest force in the Bundestag, and it will become impossible to ignore.
Impossible to ignore, but for now, Germany's firewall, the cordon sanitaire excluding the AfD from positions of power, remains in place. It did crack somewhat a couple of weeks back when Friedrich Merz relied on their votes to push through a proposal in Parliament. How committed is the man who will most likely be the next chancellor to this consensus?
That's the big question that everyone is asking. I mean, you speak to people. I spoke to members of the AfD last night at their election campaign evening, and they sensed that something had shifted with that vote, because they know that if he is willing to do it for a non-binding motion in the German Parliament, then he may well be willing to do it when it comes down to things like getting his migration proposals through the German Parliament. And so what we heard last night was Alice Weidel say, my hand is outstretched, and that doesn't necessarily mean for her that it's coalition or nothing. I mean, I think that the AfD will be looking at any manner of way that they can influence the next government. And as we heard, it could well be that government takes a long time to be formed. It could be a quite unstable government, especially if there are disagreements over the centre-right plans to tackle migration. And it could be that the AfD is then the only option for Friedrich Merz, and that's why they're standing there and they're saying we're willing to do that. Now, it's worth saying that last night, while the leader of the party, the Chancellor candidate Alice Weidel, was saying our hand is outstretched to the centre-right, there were other senior figures in the radical right of the party telling journalists that they would not work with the centre-right until they made a clear break with the Angela Merkel era and denounced what he said was multiculturalism in Germany. So there is a split, like a kind of tension within the party, but at the moment they sense that they can reunite it because they have just got their best result ever, and all they have to do is stand on the sidelines and offer to help whoever is in power with when it comes to the issues that the AfD care about, and the core issue for them is migration.
But Merz has stressed over and over again that he will, of course, not form a coalition with the AfD. Just to make that clear to our viewers, Matthew, the AfD did come in first in 5 states in former East Germany. What makes them so popular there?
There's a number of reasons for that. One of them is that there's a sense that in the east of the country there's maybe not as much loyalty to political parties because of the history of the former East. There's another issue that is when you look at income, net wealth in Germany. There's a strong correlation between things like how much financial security people have, and in the East, Germans have less financial security than those in the West, and then they're more likely to vote for a party that's offering lots of solutions to the problems that they see around them. The other issue that has played into the AfD's hands in recent years has been the issue of the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the former East Germany, there's a lot more sympathy for Russia because of the shared the history, the languages. basically that meant that people were torn about that, and then the AFD was the only party, or one of the only parties, really a big party, saying we shouldn't be sending weapons, and we should be constantly talking about trying to pursue diplomatic channels. And so for the voters there, that only meant that the AFD was the only party really that they could turn to. And you also have to look at things like we've just seen in the numbers that have come out. The AFD won the most votes, was the strongest party among the unemployed, among low-skilled workers, and it is those are the kind of we know that the difference between the East and the West in Germany, that economic, if you like, that those who are economic less well off, less prosperous, there's a huge number in the East, and so it just comes together to mean that the AFD is very much their stronghold. What they were hoping for last night, Nicole, was to score their first direct constituency win in the West, the former West Germany, and that didn't transpire. Having said that, they have got their best result ever, and with that comes a huge financial gain, because they will get more money through that, and with that comes also just more the normalisation of the party, which is incredibly important for the party.
Yeah, all that said, they will hold 152 out of the 630 seats in the new parliament. How do you expect them to wield that influence?
It's going to change the tenor of the debate in the Bundestag hugely. Already the AfD was a very loud fraction in the Bundestag. Constant jeering. Now they're going to have more than double the number of seats than they had last time, and that's just going to have a big impact on the mood and the atmosphere in the German Parliament in the next 4 years. And as I said, with that huge increase in the number of members of Parliament comes a lot more money that the party can spend on professionalising itself, on spending on marketing, and that's an area where the AfD has really been ahead of the other parties, is spending on its targeted campaigning and selling itself on social platforms like TikTok, on YouTube. And so the ability to get all this money that comes with being a big force in the German Parliament will be used to essentially sell themselves as the only answer, the alternative to the problems that Germany faces. And so that is why there is so much pressure on Friedrich Merz, the man who is most likely to be the next Chancellor of Germany, to establish a coalition quickly and to get a handle on the problems that Germans face. Otherwise, the AfD will be sitting on the sidelines saying we are the answer, and they will be a very attractive force for many people out there if the government in power doesn't get a grip on the problems.
That's DW's Matthew Moore standing by for us here in Berlin. Thanks so much. Julia Saudelli and Jan Techa are still with us here. Julia, the big German parties seem to be at a loss when it comes to finding ways to win those voters back who turned to the far right, whether it be out of disillusionment or out of protest. What are they missing?
Well, I think actually what we've seen is, especially from the conservative CDU, the party actually taking on some of the rhetoric and some of the big topics that have been successful for the AfD, and hoping to win back voters that way. For example, with Friedrich Merz from the CDU actually really pushing for migration to be one of the leading topics of the debate in the last few months. We've seen that happen repeatedly, and in a way, he was hoping that would lead some of maybe unconvinced CDU voters who might be considering voting for the AfD to say, okay, the CDU is now saying they want to be tougher on migration, let's vote for them. There are studies that show that this doesn't necessarily work. It's happened in the past in other European countries and other countries in the world, where actually when more centrist moderate parties take on some of the rhetoric and the discourse of more extreme parties, people ultimately go vote for the extreme party. And in a way, we have seen that a bit happening this time too. The voters that ended up not voting for the CDU this time, even though they had in the past, the biggest number of them ended up voting for the AfD in this case. So whether this strategy has really worked for the CDU is a big question. I would argue that possibly it hasn't.
Yeah, this shift to the right, is not something we're only seeing in Germany, is it? We're seeing it all over Europe, basically, in the US as well. To what extent would you say that this is part of a broader trend that is not specific to Germany per se?
I mean, when you look at the European landscape alone, it's quite clear that Germany so far has been the total outlier. You look at France, you look at the UK, you look at Italy, you look at Poland, you look at a number of smaller countries like Austria or the Netherlands or some Scandinavian countries, and it's quite clear that all of these countries have moved to the right. And in all of them, with the exception of Spain, there's basically no classic center-left party, center-right party, a classic conservative party, Christian Democrats. They've all disappeared and are now splinter groups. Germany is still the big outlier, where a classic, center-right party like the CDU-CSU can, score near the 30% mark, unthinkable in other places. So, Germany is kind of late in that development. And in order not to fall into that same trap, as the French conservatives, who are basically non-existent, Friedrich Merz made this gamble. He said, we need to gain back some maneuvering space on the key issue that drives the far right, migration. It will initially hurt us, but we need to strategically gain back this kind of, maneuvering space, the ability to act on that issue, because otherwise we just give it, for free to the far right, and we build some sort of taboo around it. And if you can't talk about it anymore, they will win. You give it to them for free. So he's trying to break through. I think it's a longer gamble. I'm not sure it's going to succeed, but it's the desperate attempt of the last center-right party in Europe standing to not fall into the same trap that the others have fallen into. If they can successfully now change migration policy, remove a part of a real problem, this is not just an imaginary far-right problem, there's a genuine problem in Germany and elsewhere as well. If they can now, straighten this out, toughen migration policy without, going into extremes, then they might have a chance to not fall into that trap and escape the fate that other centrist parties on the right, were unable to escape.
Are the Social Democrats going to do them the favor of assisting them in that endeavor?
Yeah, that is the big question. We have already seen with the Social Democrats in government, also on their part, I would say, a move to the right on issues like migration. They have had to toughen their rules on asylum, on expelling asylum seekers who have been refused. This has been a big part also of the last few months of their government, and they managed to push through these measures also in a coalition with the Greens, who are on migration, have or at least used to have quite a different stance. They might be forced to go along with some of the proposals that the CDU wants to bring forward, because that's the only way that a coalition government will work. And the Social Democrats have said they want to be responsible. They want to do something for the good of the country. The question is also what kind of proposals the CDU is going to bring forward and how sort of tough those are going to be. And whether the SPD can actually, explain that to their voters.